This is the Automotive History Podcast, and I'm Zachary Mountain. Episode 0.1, Carl Benz and the Patent Motorwagen. Carl Benz is the true inventor of the automobile. The automobile, literally speaking, just means any object that propels itself. Examples of automobiles can be found long before Carl Benz says horseless carriage to the road, but there are several distinct differences that set Benz's creation apart from earlier attempts. These early examples would only travel a short distance before breaking down and being abandoned by their creators. None of their creators had the vision of a world that didn't rely on horses for transportation like Benz did. Auto historian Steve Nixon defines inventor as not a person who invents, fails, disappears, and is forgotten, but one who produces something, develops it, and in the course of time turns it to the purpose intended. By this definition, Carl Benz is certainly the original inventor of the automobile as we know it today. The Benz family came from a line of blacksmiths that lived in Pfaffenau, a remote village in the Black Forest of Germany. Carl's father, Hans George, was fascinated by trains and left the village to pursue a career in the young German railroad industry. George married the orphan of a conscript in Napoleon's army. He died young at 37, leaving behind his wife and 2-year-old son Carl. His birth certificate is signed Carl with a K, but he chose to spell it with a C. From a young age, Carl showed an aptitude for physics and chemistry. He disliked sports and reading and never seemed content unless he was working in his improvised lab at home. Carl uses knowledge in science to make money. He would take and develop photographs and perform watch repair for the isolated villagers. He used these jobs to help support his widowed mother, and along with a small state pension, they were able to keep the wolves from the door. At age 17, Carl started going to a polytechnic, which is a vocational school of higher learning, where he studied under Professor Ferdinand Redenbacher, a world-renowned engineer and author. Redenbacher believed that internal combustion engine was the way of the future and that steam engines would be regulated to heavy-duty task only. It is here, listening to the lectures of this great man, that young Carl was inspired to begin dreaming of a horseless carriage. Carl studied at the college for 4 years before he decided to go out into the world and put what he had learned to good use. His first job after college was an inglorious bench job at a locomotive factory. He worked long hours from 6 a.m. to 7 p.m. After working all day, most would be inclined to slack off in the 3 or so hours of free time they had. But not Carl. He spent his scarce free time locked in a small room, drawing up models for a horseless carriage. He spent 2.5 years doing monotonous labor before finding a job that gave him more creative freedom. Carl worked at a drawing office where he designed scales and other machinery for 2 years. During his free time, he continued working on the horseless carriage. During this time, he met a young lady named Bertha Ringer, and after a 2-year engagement, they finally got married. Bertha was one of the most influential people in Carl's life. She believed wholeheartedly in her husband and his dream of creating the horseless carriage. Carl would be ridiculed, laughed at, and told he was insane when he told others about his dream of replacing the horse with engines. But this was never the case with Bertha. Anytime her husband would suffer a setback, she would be there for him to offer words of encouragement. She even got her own hands dirty on numerous occasions. It is feasible that without the unrelenting support of his wife, that Carl may have given up on his dream in pursuit of more lucrative opportunities. Carl later said of Bertha, "Only one person remained with me in the small ship of life when it seemed destined to sink. That was my wife. Bravely and resolutely, she set the new sails of hope." Benz saved up money and in 1871 opened a shop of his own in Mannheim, where he worked to design a 2-stroke internal combustion engine that would be suitable for driving pumps. His pursuit left him penniless, and on the same night that his first engine ran, he was so broke that he couldn't afford dinner for him and his wife. When Benz's first business partner turned out to be dead weight, Bertha got her father to front her money from her dowry to buy him out. Benz struggled to find new investors for his business. No one, it seemed, trusted internal combustion engines. They were a new technology at the time, and people feared that they would explode. Eventually, Benz found a financial partner, Bueller, who was impressed with the work Benz had done for him. With this new support, Benz was able to start producing engines of his own design that ran as air and gas pumps. Benz designed them as two-stroke units to avoid paying licensing fees for Otto's four-stroke cycle. Benz's engines were smaller and less expensive than steam engines, and they gained a reputation for reliability. His success started changing the biases that people had against the internal combustion engine. The business, Mannheim Gas Engine Company, grew and soon employed 40 workmen and attracted several more investors. But even with this success, Carl had never given up on his dream of making a practical automobile. But when he unveiled his idea to the other stockholders, they were completely put off. They thought Carl was crazy and wanted nothing to do with his mad idea. After all, didn't the world have enough horses? From then on, he would have to carry out his work in secret. He told his business partners that he was working on new engine designs, when really he was working on his automobile. Benz's plans began to take shape, and he made a last appeal to Bueller. He explained that he was discontent with his engines being used for nothing more than simple pumps when he knew that they had so much more potential. Carl was frustrated with the lack of imaginations in his partners, and he demanded that some of the company money be invested in research and development for his automobile. His partners refused, and Carl Benz was left with no other choice. He either had to leave the company he started or turn away from his dream of building cars. Carl Benz chose the former and parted ways with the Mannheim Gas Engine Company. Benz started a new company with Max Rose, a wealthy merchant that Benz had known for several years. Benz made it clear to Rose that the whole point of starting the company would ultimately be so that Benz could pursue what he really wanted, to manufacture automobiles. However, Benz also made it clear that until the company could turn a sustainable profit, it would first focus on stationary gas engines. Rose did not believe in the automobile, but was willing to go along with it to do business with Benz. Benz had many problems to solve in creating the car. There was no precedent to follow, and the whole thing had to be created from scratch. Will the car have 3 or 4 wheels? What kind of engine should it have? What would ignite the fuel, and how would the power be sent to the wheels were all questions that Benz would have to answer. Carl chose 3 wheels because he couldn't figure out the steering he would need for 4. The engine was a horizontal one-cylinder unit that revved to a then high redline of 250 RPM, where it made 1 horsepower. It sent that horsepower to the rear wheel via a belt-drive 2-speed transmission. The vehicle had wire wheels similar to a bicycle. It was steered not by a wheel but by a tiller. It used a carburetor of Carl's own design and had seating for 2. One of the more interesting conclusions is Benz's decision to use benzene as the fuel source. He chose benzene after hearing the story of a local woman who had purchased some benzene to use as a cleaning solution for her gloves. After putting her gloves in a container of benzene, she went to work in the kitchen, and when she lit the stove, the vapors from the jar of benzene ignited. There was an explosion, a fire, and several people were killed. But Benz had found the solution he needed to fuel his car. Most of that first car quickly became obsolete, but there is 3 things that it had in common with almost every vehicle on the road today: electric ignition, a differential gear, and a water-cooled engine. In the spring of 1885, after a decade of hard work and dedication to the idea of the motor vehicle, Benz was finally standing in front of the fruit of his labor, ready to try and change the world. Initially, the engine started right up, but with only 1 horsepower, it proved not to be powerful enough to get going from a standstill. With the help of a couple of his workers, Benz push-started his car and took off around the grounds of his workshop. His workers ran behind him, shouting words of encouragement. Bertha Benz was there that day as well and could hardly contain her excitement. The vehicle had made 4 laps before the ignition wire broke. It was repaired, and several more laps were made before a chain snapped and they called it a day. Although the journey was short, the principle was proven. A horseless carriage was possible. Max Rose, Benz's business partner, was malaise towards the whole project, and for a time, Benz turned his attention back on the fundamental business of creating stationary engines to put Rose at ease. Nonetheless, he still dedicated his free time to improving and strengthening his original design. That autumn, Benz was ready to show off his work to the world and invited all who were interested, including Max Rose and several of his friends, to the grounds of his factory to behold what had been created. A crowd gathered, and Carl gave a short lecture on what they were about to witness. But when his assistant went to spin the giant flywheel to get the engine started, there was no response. The vehicle had to be push-started, and when it finally did get going, Benz was so preoccupied with keeping it running that he plowed the car straight into a brick wall. The machine was mangled, and the Benz family was just as crushed emotionally as their car was. Benz rebuilt and improved the broken parts from the car, and before long he was testing it again. But now there would be no pageantry to it. Benz was determined to get everything perfect before boasting publicly again. This proved to be extremely hard to do though, because every time Benz would take his vehicle out for testing, a crowd would form and follow him around, looking at him and his machine in awe. The car was still a fragile experimental vehicle, and inevitably a weak leak would rear its ugly head and the car would come to a stop. And when it did, the crowd would start laughing at Carl. But with each attempt, his vehicle was able to travel farther and farther. Soon all of Mannheim knew about what Carl was doing, and the crowds that followed him on these experimental trips grew. They got so big, Benz was worried that the police would bring a halt to his experiments for causing a ruckus. Benz was forced to move his experiments to late night, early mornings when few would be on the road. The newspapers began covering his work, and the first article about Benz appeared on June 4, 1886. Subsequent articles were written in the same paper to keep the public up to date on the progress Benz was making. Benz allowed some of his mechanics to drive the car on occasion, but gave them strict orders not to drive at excessive speeds. Evidently, one of the mechanics ignored his rules because Carl got called to the police station, where the chief told him that driving his car was against the law. Benz responded with a passionate plea to allow him to continue. He explained how much hard work it had taken him to get to this point, and how much he had improved his machine, how much precaution he had taken with its operation, and even made an appeal to nationalism, saying that if he were to be restricted in his work, another country would inevitably take the lead in designing and manufacturing automobiles. Carl won permission to drive his car in the city limits, but he would have to reach out to the Minister of Baden for permission to drive beyond that. Carl wrote to the Minister of Baden to request permission to drive outside the city. The minister responded that he can drive wherever he wants as long as he goes no faster than 6 kilometers an hour or 3.7 miles per hour within the city of Mannheim and 12 kilometers an hour or 7.5 miles per hour in the country. For reference, the average walking speed is 3.1 miles per hour. Benz was set beside himself when he read this. How could he possibly bring his invention to the masses if he was confined to a snail's pace? In America, we would probably just ignore this law and ask for proof of our guilt later. But Benz is German, and Germans always follow the rules. He set about forming a plan to show the minister his misguidance. Carl invited the minister to come to Mannheim to take a ride in his car. Benz arranged to have one of his employees pick up the minister from the train station with strict orders not to exceed the speed limit. A milk cart was conscripted into the plot, and the plan was to have the milk cart blow past the slowly moving automobile, while the driver of the milk cart laughed and jeered at how slow the automobile was going. Benz was so thorough in his preparations that he even had rehearsals so that they could make sure everything would go just right. When the minister arrived, Ben's employee picked him up right on time as they had planned, and immediately after setting off, the minister's displeasure with the pace was already evident. The milk cart flew by with the driver howling and all. This is when the minister finally let out. "Good heavens, man, are you going to take all day to cover a mile or so? I could pass anything on the road if only I were allowed to do so," replied the driver, "but I'm forbidden by the police." "Never mind about that. We can't have milk carts passing us. Push her along as hard as she will go," said the minister. The plan had worked perfectly. After a further demonstration on the working of the vehicle, the minister assured Benz that he would no longer have to worry about his work being hobbled by speed limits. Now that Benz was free to travel where and at the speeds that he pleased, he set to venture through the Black Forest. The effect that the car had on the villagers was hysterical and remarkable. Word had not gotten out of Mannheim about his invention, and when the rural villagers saw it, they shrieked in horror. People ran away from it as if their lives were at stake. Several old people, unable to run, dropped to their knees and made the sign of the cross to ward against what they must have thought was some kind of devil or evil spirit. In other places, villagers gathered and attempted to slay the beast. Many rocks were hurled Ben's way. Carl would take time to stop and talk to the villagers to show them how his car operates and explain that they had nothing to fear from it. These long trips helped Benz to develop his car into a practical and reliable vehicle. Now that Benz had his proof of concept, he needed investors so he could start manufacturing and selling them. Benz was underwhelmed by the enthusiasm for his invention. In his eyes, the future was clear and the days of the horse and buggy were numbered, but few others shared his same faith. Benz decided to look outside of Germany for support. In 1887, he entered his car into the Paris exhibition. Benz was hoping to draw some attention to his product and maybe even attract investors, but the exhibit was a flop. The car was lined up alongside horse-drawn vehicles, it was given no prominence, and few probably understood what exactly they were looking at. Benz learned from his failures at the Paris exhibition, and he would make sure not to make the same mistakes again when he put his vehicle on exhibit at the Munich Imperial Exhibition a few months later. Benz initially was not allowed to drive his car at the exhibit, but after some pleading with the police, they agreed to look the other way so he could not only display his Motorwagen, but also show it in motion. Benz caused quite a stir. A small crowd followed the vehicle everywhere it went, and each day the number of people at the exhibit grew. Benz was finally starting to get the attention and praise he deserved. At the close of the exhibition, Benz was awarded the highest reward available, the Gold Star. As previously mentioned, Bertha Benz was extremely important in the development of the automobile because of the belief she had in her husband. But during the summer of 1888, she would cement her own place in history. Bertha Benz and her two teenage sons took the first road trip ever without Carl's knowledge. They set out early in the morning and left Carl a note explaining where they were going. Carl's sons, 13-year-old Richard and 15-year-old Eugene, had grown up around their father's work and knew a great deal about the car, but were not allowed to drive it by themselves. Their father or one of his foremen were always there telling them to slow down and where they could drive. Bertha wanted to visit some relatives in Pforzheim, so the three of them got together and conspired to go on this journey. They had to do all this behind Carl's back because he was too cautious to take the vehicle on the 120-mile round trip. The three of them encountered several problems along the way. The fuel line for the carburetor clogged up, which Bertha remedied with her hairpin. On another occasion, Bertha used her garter as an improvised insulation for an ignition wire, and they stopped at a cobbler's place to get new leather for the worn-out brakes. Their pit stop at a drugstore for more benzene made it the first gas station in history. Everywhere they went, people would look on in amazement. During one stop, a fight almost broke out between two townspeople over what propelled the vehicle. One of the men claimed it was supernatural, the other thought it was some kind of clockwork. The two men were about to come to blows until Ben's family lifted up the seat to show them that they were both wrong. The long trip helped to expose many flaws in the automobile that needed to be fixed for it to take its rightful place as the main form of transportation. Along with the mechanical repairs it needed, the fact that two of the passengers had to get out and push from behind to assist the car up certain hills helped Carl see the necessity of installing a third gear. During this trip, Bertha showed that women had a place right alongside men in the future of the automobile, a fact that took some countries another 120 years to learn. Although Germany had birthed the two men most responsible for bringing about the age of the automobile, it was France that gave the car the most warm embrace. The first car sold by Benz in 1887 was to a Frenchman named Emile Roger. He was quite enthusiastic and started selling cars for Carl in France. When anti-German sentiment began rising, he purchased motors from Carl Benz and constructed cars around them. These came to be known as Roger Benzes, and they were one of the first automobiles manufactured in France. Emile Lesavour was taken on his first car ride by Carl Benz himself and went on to co-found Panhard, which was one of the largest automobile manufacturers during the first half of the 20th century. Customers were few and far between. Benz was an engineer, not a businessman, and even when he did manage to find an enthusiastic customer, things did not always go off without a hitch. An order that was placed after the successful Munich exhibition was canceled after the father of the boy who wanted to purchase it declared the sale null and void on the grounds that his son was insane. After all, he must be if he wanted to purchase something as loony as an automobile. The father even sent his son to an asylum. Benz received a good deal of flack for this story, as some of his less enthusiastic friends thought all of his customers would share a similar fate. They didn't, though, and some customers tell an entirely opposite story. When a young woman in Hungary purchased a car from Benz, she telegraphed her friends telling them that her and her fiancé would be coming back from the train station in a carriage that had no horses. The villagers lined the street and erected triumphant arches to welcome the couple. It was the first car ever in Hungary, and its presence was greeted with bouquets and loud cheers. Another early customer of Benz wanted to purchase his car so he could enjoy his retirement by taking long, leisurely trips. Benz sold him a model dubbed Comfortable, which might make this the first GT car. The The customer was delighted with his purchase and planned many trips to go see the world in it. One day while driving downhill, he lost control and plowed right through a shop window, but even this did not stifle his enthusiasm. In 1890, Max Rose took his leave from the company. He and Benz had been successful business partners, and his financial contribution had made it possible for Benz to bring forth the age of the automobile. Even though Rose was there from the beginning and had witnessed all that Benz had accomplished, he was still not a believer. When it came time to separate from his longtime partner, he told Benz that he should have nothing to do with automobiles and should just concentrate on stationary engines. Clearly, Rose did not understand it, and he never would. This would not prove to be a setback in the least for Carl. His automobiles were now garnering so much attention that finding an investor would be much easier than it was before. The most important thing for Carl would be to find someone who, aside from having deep pockets, would also be enthusiastic about the future of the car. His new partner would also have to be experienced in the world of business so that Carl could focus solely on the mechanical. He found two men who were perfect fits, Friedrich von Fischer and Julius Goss. Von Fischer took the lead in sales in Germany while Goss focused on international markets. Business was finally booming and they moved out of their small workshop into a larger factory. Benz began working on a four-wheel version of his car. The first car he built with four wheels became known as the Victoria. It made 3 to 6 horsepower and was manufactured from 1892 to 1898. The Victoria had a 4-seater version called the Vis-a-Vis. It had 2 benches that face each other, so the driver would have to look over his passengers to see where he was going. This seems insane today, but people were used to riding in carriages and facing each other at the time, so several early car manufacturers used this setup. The company followed up on this success with the launch of the Velocipede, nicknamed the Vallejo. It was designed to be a small, affordable car. Its engine produced between 1.5 to 3.5 horsepower, depending on the year and model. The Vallejo was the first serial-produced car, and between 1894 and 1901, over 1,200 were made. The Vallejo was very reliable and loved by its owners. Benz's work had sparked interest around the globe in production of automobiles, and by the turn of the 20th century, there were many competing companies. In 1900, Benz's company, Benz & C, produced 603 automobiles, more than any other company, but by the following year, sales had dropped to just 385. It is clear that the way of the future was the automobile, but not the kind Benz & C was currently producing. While other manufacturers continually developed and updated their designs, Benz stuck stubbornly to the principles of his early cars. Even after companies like Panhard had made developments like a front engine layout, drive shafts, and a vertical engine that had become standard on most contemporary cars, Benz continued to use his rear engine mounted under the driver's seat with power being transferred to the wheels via a belt. He continued with this design well past the point that these were viewed as obsolete. Julius Goss begged Carl to redesign the vehicle, but Carl stubbornly refused. It's ironic that as a young man, Carl had to fight against narrow-mindedness to try to bring his vehicle to life, and now he was the one holding back progress. By 1902, it was clear that the entire car had to be redesigned to keep up with the competition. The company hired French engineers to help breathe new life into the stagnant company. The resulting car was called the Benz Parseval. It had a vertical 2-cylinder engine that was mounted in the front of the vehicle, with power being delivered to the wheels via a prop shaft. Ben took issue with the direction the company was going and removed himself from the design team, but would return to the company that bore his name soon after in a mostly symbolic position on their supervisory board. This was the end of the rear-mounted, single-cylinder, horizontal engine with a belt-driven drivetrain that had been the basis for Benz automobiles. This was the layout that had made the dream of a horseless carriage a reality. Benz had worked his whole life to create it, and in less than 2 decades, it was laughably obsolete and underpowered. These vehicles were not without their fans, however. Carl, unsurprisingly, continued to drive his little belt-drive car, and he wasn't the only one. Reliability was always Carl's primary concern, and the dependability of his cars endeared them to their owners well after their production ended. The Benz importer in England, for example, had traveled 5,000 miles in 50 consecutive days, save for Sunday, and has reported that never once, from end to end of the route, did she falter or slacken, responding to every motion of her driver with perfect promptitude. Another owner was still driving his 1901 4.5 horsepower model in 1910. When asked why, he explained that he had avoided a multitude of sorrow by being true to his first love. In 1906, Carl and his son Eugene formed their own company, Benz and Schoen, to continue producing cars of their own design. The company made 4-cylinder front-mounted engine cars. The company was moderately successful. Many of their cars came to be used as London taxis, where they gained a reputation for reliability. The same basic car was continually developed until outbreak of World War I in 1914. After the war, the company continued for a short while building its pre-war models until they gave up on full car production in 1923. Benz Schoen continued on as a parts manufacturer until 2010. By 1929, Carl Benz was in bad health. In his lifetime, he had managed to change the world forever. By the time he had passed, the automobile had almost completely replaced the horse in industrialized countries. 2 days before he died, a parade of over 700 automobiles drove past his house in Landenberg to pay their respect. On April 4, 1929, Carl Benz, secure in the knowledge that he had completed his life's work, passed away peacefully in his own home, surrounded by loved ones. Benz & C remained and was a successful company. We will talk about Benz & C after Carl's departure in 1903 more in a future episode. But next up we will look across the Black Forest to Gottlieb Daimler and William Maybach to discuss their important contributions to the automobile and their ambition to use internal combustion engines to power pretty much everything.